So I had a couple weeks to work on this, and so I refined these slides a lot, which meant I spent way too much time thinking of 80s and 90s kids era jokes and early internet memes. So get ready. So today we were talking about Kretzschmaria, and I've always thought that like Kretzschmaria spelled out looks like the bottom line of an optical eye exam. And while I'm talking about this, so a couple goals for this lesson today. Kretzschmaria is by far the most important decay fungus for you to recognize and to understand a few things about. And this is a great book that you can pick up off the ISA website. Christopher Luley is the author. He's got a PhD in forest pathology, and he identifies for the East Coast 5 fungi that he feels like every arborist should be able to recognize, and Kretzschmaria is the one that he says is the most important. And there are really important implications for the tree and then for you as climbers, and you're probably familiar with a lot of this material already, but I really want you to be able to distinguish it from other things that might appear like it, and to understand just a few basic facts about it. So while I'm talking, I'm gonna pass around a little bag of pieces of Kretzschmaria that I've been able to wiggle off trees. And I want you to feel like the texture of it and understand that this is sort of like what you're looking for. When you're looking at a tree that's like blackened around the roots, you need to be able to peel a piece of it off. And so just to have that kind of like textile relationship with it, even like crumble up some of it between your fingers. All right, so Kretzschmaria deusta. Maybe. My computer might be frozen. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Let's click. All right. So just kind of setting up, putting this into relation with other fungi that you might already know. So it's in the family Xylariaceae. We've already talked about hypoxylon canker. Interestingly, this is related. Dead man's fingers, if you're familiar with those, the kind of like creepy little black gray things that you might find around the base of trees sometimes, that's also in this family. There are some other crusts that will show up on like branches or smaller twigs that are also related. So the taxonomy for Kretzschmaria has shifted a few times, and I've heard older arborists refer to it by other names like Ustulina deusta or Hypoxylon deustum. It used to be in the genus Hypoxylon. And then, of course, we know it as brittle cinder more commonly. All right, so this is one of those slides I had way too much fun putting together. If you're familiar with, was this NSYNC or Backstreet Boys?
Both.
Okay, yeah, Backstreet Boys. If I was a braver soul, I would sing this out for you. So this black crust is the fruiting body, meaning it is not the organism itself. And this is the sexual phase. There are two phases to Kretzschmaria, and they both look different, and we're gonna get to that in a second. But the point that I really wanna drive home with this is that I think you could forgivably assume that the way that this operates is you have this crust on the outside that's kind of eating away a patch of wood as it develops. And that is not the case. This is not the organism. This is just the means by which it reproduces, the means by which it spreads. So the actual organism is a series of really, really small hyphae within the wood that's kind of traveling from wood cell to wood cell, creating tiny little pockets in one of the critical layers of the cell wall. This is just the observable fruit that we will see. So this isn't really signaling where the fungus is necessarily restricted to within the tree. It's just showing us that it is been in the tree long enough to where it's now sexually reproducing. And it goes through an asexual phase first. And interestingly, this is what that asexual phase looked like. It's gonna show up in the spring to early summer. This does not have the textile quality of what's being passed around. This is more smooth, it's kind of velvety. You might even see like a little guttation, that droplet right there. And it can show up around the edges of an older fruiting body. So you might see a large black patch that's got that typical crusty look, and then around the edges, it's this white to gray.
You're saying this is asexual?
This is, yeah, asexual. This is the first phase. Yeah, so late spring to early summer. I've only seen this like a few times. It's not super common, but just keep it in your head. This is what it looks like, because it's quite different from what's being passed around texturally. You're not going to be, yeah.
Is that just like when it's growing and expanding on its own within the tree?
So the interesting thing about pretty much all decay fungi and Kretzschmaria in general is that there's not a lot of really detailed information that's easily accessible. So I don't actually know. I know with weeping polypore, if you're familiar with that one, you'll find it big lumpy thing at the base of oak trees. It's really notable because it will have this guttation or these like water droplets like all over it. And I have read that the guttation is happening when the fruiting body is most metabolically active, like when it's growing and expanding. So that might be the case, but are you asking about the actual kind of mycelium and the hyphae within the tree, or just the fruiting body on the outside?
I think I'm wondering because it's the asexual phase, it's not like releasing spores at that point.
It is releasing,
Oh, it is?
well, it's releasing conidia. And this is getting a little bit into the weeds. You don't need to, this isn't super important to our discussion, but it is interesting. So the question there is whether if the conidia land on a vulnerable surface, so like a basal wound or something, if the conidia is sufficient to expand, and based on the reading I've been able to find, it's unknown whether the asexual phase can produce like spores or conidia that are have sufficient enough genetic information to like start a new patch. But so interesting question, but not.
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
does or does this not turn into the crust?
It does, yeah.
It does, okay.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's why I mentioned that sometimes you'll see like the area of the more typical like bubbly black crust that you're used to seeing, and then it'll be rimmed by something that resembles that, yeah. So the main point here is just to be able to recognize that it will present itself in two different ways. All right, so why is it such a big deal? As I already mentioned, Luli talks about it as being one of the most important fungi to be able to recognize as far as urban decay. It is a soft rot. That is different than the typical brown or white rots that we are talking about. It's got a really interesting mode of decay where, I don't know, have you ever seen an illustration of what a wood cell looks like? It's layered. They talk about the primary wall, there's the secondary wall, which is composed of 3 layers, the S1, S2, S3 layer. In other words, it's a complex thing, a wood cell wall. It's not just like a brick wall on the border of Mexico. It's got parts. And the S2 layer is what it invades, and the S2 layer is the most important layer within that secondary wall for providing strength to wood. And essentially what the fungus does is it gets into that S2 layer and it creates a little cavity. And we're not talking about a cavity that you can sound out with a hammer. These are really, really tiny. The cell walls themselves are not visible, and we're talking about a small portion of like a not visible cell wall. And so it goes from S2 layer to S2 layer, and each cell creating these little cavities, rapidly degrading the strength of the wood. So, and then it is also interesting in that it produces an abundance of these pseudosclerotial plates, or these zone lines that we talked about with the hypoxylon canker. So I've seen trees that did not present the fruiting body, but there was a cavity, and I could see these really thick black plates inside. I think because I haven't read about anything else producing those like at the base of the trees, that sometimes you might be seeing trees that have Kretzschmaria that maybe don't have the crust for whatever reason. And that might be shown in a crosscut by seeing like a heavy abundance of spalting or these zone lines. There's no treatment for it. Some sources will talk about using phosphites. Reliant would be the product we have, a phosphite-based fungicide, in order to slow it, but it's not really certain how effective that is or whether it's worth doing. And nothing will eliminate it from the tree. And then as far as diagnosing the extent of decay, it's really tough. This is not a fungus that is necessarily going to produce a cavity that you can detect with a mallet. It's going to lack some of the more, in other words, when the tree is primed and ready to come down, it's not necessarily going to be obvious visually with a sonic tomographer, because it's not really affecting the sonic capacity of the wood. Sonic tomography, which is one of our most advanced assessment tools when it comes to wood decay, is not reliable when it comes to fleshing out how advanced a Kretzschmaria infection might be. And then even resistance drilling because the fungus is primarily going after cellulose initially, which is the part of the cell wall that gives trees their bending strength or strength and tension. And it's initially leaving behind lignin. For whatever reason, that means that because I've never done a resistance drill test, but for people that have, they say it's really hard to detect the difference in wood that's been decayed by Kretzschmaria because of its leaving behind the lignin, at least initially. So we don't have great methods. Once we see Kretzschmaria in a tree, we don't have great methods to determine how long it's been there or how advanced the decay might be. And then another important point is the crown health, is not indicative of how advanced that infection may be either. I've seen a few trees, we're going to come across a picture of one that have Kretzschmaria that have perfectly healthy crowns. But that's something that you'll see clients associate tree stability with quite a bit, as they'll talk about, well, it's got a healthy crown, so I'm not too worried about it. With Kretzschmaria in particular, that is not a sign that the infection isn't advanced. And then something else that I thought was really interesting is that even in a stump cut, advanced infection may not be super visible in the stump cut itself. And I think that has to do with the fact that it's degrading like a small portion of the cell wall. And so the tree has lost a lot of strength before we're seeing these like extensive like zone lines or areas of discoloration. So you can't necessarily, so if a tree has been bid for removal, for example, because of Kretzschmaria, and then you cut it down and the stump looks relatively intact, there's not a lot of discoloration, that doesn't mean it was a bad decision to take out that tree necessarily. The really tough thing about this fungus is how many unknowns there are for how fast it's acting. There's not a lot of great information as to whether it moves more slowly through certain species. Some European sources do make the claim that it moves more slowly through certain trees, more so than others, but there's no list. There's no research that's been done that details out like what those might be. And the list of trees that it affects is really broad. I've seen it in red and white oaks. I've seen it in sycamores. What are some trees that you all have seen it in? Hickories, definitely.
Beech maple.
Beech and maple. Maple seems to be consistently the tree that you should be most concerned about.
I've seen it in locust.
Yeah, locust.
I've seen it in ironwood. I've seen it in
Ironwood.
definitely elm and hackberry.
Hackberry is another one that comes up consistently as a tree to be very concerned about.
But I've also even seen it in holly, like a little.
Yeah, it's pretty much any broadleaf tree, and this will be covered in another slide. Interestingly, this is just purely a point, like a little piece of trivia. It's also been found in Chamaecyparis thyoides, or the Atlantic white cedar. So there's one conifer gymnosperm that occurs in North Carolina. But
I mean, it's more interesting what you don't typically see it in.
Yeah.
Sweet gums, tulip poplars, but it's supposed to be able to give tulip poplar.
I think that I've seen it in sweet gum.
I think I have too, but it's so rare. Maybe I've not trusted my eyes.
Yeah, I don't know that I have seen it in tulip poplar either. Yeah, and so this point I bring up because I could see a scenario in which a client comes out and they look at a stump of a tree that they've been told is a hazard, and they're like, there's nothing going on in the stump, like why did we cut this down? So just good to know in the back of your head that you're not necessarily going to see the visual cues that make it obvious that this tree was a hazard. All right, so this tree had a perfectly healthy canopy. You can see the pseudosclerotial plates, or what look like lines in cross section, but some of these kind of like black areas. This is obviously really advanced, and in all likelihood there were several things kind of like chewing away at the base of this tree. I have seen, I've got a beech outside of where I live that has Kretzschmaria. In fact, that's where a lot of what's being passed around came from, and I've seen at least 2 other decay fungi fruiting from the same cankers. I think Ganoderma, and then one thing I haven't been able to identify. And so oftentimes with trees, I think of it like the Gulliver's Travels, where you have all the tiny people that, like roped the guy down. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah, that's sometimes how I think about like tree mortality, is just this sort of joint effort between a lot of different organisms. But so the point that I'm wanting to make here is that fruiting itself is, at least according to Luli, again, who has a PhD in forest pathology, that fruiting itself is associated with advanced decay. And so you can't, because you might come across a patch that's relatively small, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not necessarily signaling something about the extent of the decay within the tree. Again, once it's showing up, because it's probably been in the tree for a number of years before it's produced that fruiting body, the assumption that we can make based on like what's published is that it's likely advanced. There's not a lot of great information that says otherwise. And so, yeah, Michael.
Does that have anything to do with sort of like a critical mass of hyphae within the decaying organism? In other words, sort of like exponential growth, where you hit that point and all of a sudden it accelerates? Is there anything in the literature that talks about that?
So what I've heard, and this is typically been talking about other mushrooms, and so I say this with a huge caveat. My main response is I don't know, but then kind of following that up with, I have read that oftentimes that certain mushrooms will fruit once their substrate is starting to run out. And so they're fruiting because it's their like release. They're like time to start a new colony somewhere else. Yeah. So I don't know if that's the case here, but that's the only thing I've read that I would maybe point to as perhaps that's an answer. Like it could also be that once it's accumulated enough energy to continue to produce the enzymes by which it's breaking down wood, and it's got that energy in abundance, then it's like, okay, I can fruit. I could also see that being a plausible explanation. Either way, though, it's had some time to build up steam and to sequester some of the carbohydrates from the tree. Okay, and then the second part of this, so decay, once it fruits, can be relatively rapid following the fruiting, with extensive decay likely in as few as 5 years. Now, this is probably going to be affected by species and their ability to compartmentalize, but we do not have any reliable literature that tells us which trees that might be. And so personally, my take on Kretzschmaria is I see all of it as an issue. Like, I don't delineate between species because you can't know how long it's been in the tree. So yeah, oaks tend to be better compartmentalizers, right? But once it's fruiting, we just don't know how long it's been in the tree. You can't assume that like you're seeing an infection that's like relatively new. And so that's kind of where I come down on any tree with Kretzschmaria, is there's a lot we don't know. It is the most concerning of our buttress root, butt rot, decay pathogens. And I don't feel like I have a lot of other information to go off to tell people like, oh yeah, we can keep this tree for like another 5 years. It's like my just kind of typical line is, this is probably something that needs to be taken care of as soon as you're able to. And more so if it's going to be maple or hackberry, because that does seem to be a consistent thread in literature, is the hackberries in particular, and then maples are really quite susceptible. And then beech in this area, I think a lot of my photos are from American beech. This is from Davy Tree, their website. So complete removal may be necessary. You all guys all know that. Internal decay may cause the structure of the tree to fail during removal. And this is the other point that I really wanted to drive home. You should be approaching any tree with Kretzschmaria with a certain amount of caution. Reducing rigging forces, maybe really trying to avoid negative rigging where you can. Especially if it's a maple, you really should not be like trusting that stem to negative rig. I've heard Craig say it, and I'll invite you here to reinforce this, that there have been a couple deaths in this area of trees collapsing with Kretzschmaria that had climbers in them. Am I remembering correctly?
No, what I think of is stories I've heard of this tree collapsing on the climber, and I asked, what was it? It was a maple, and I knew the guy didn't even know what Kretzschmaria was.
I see.
And so I just think, I would bet, if I were to guess, if I looked at the base of that tree, here's what was going on.
So when I show up to a property, I feel like half of my job is checking all the hardwoods for Kretzschmaria. That's the main thing that I'm looking for when I'm walking around the base of the tree. I'll advise clients to remove ivy from the base of trees to help arborists in the future better to inspect their trees. And it's primarily so we can look at Kretzschmaria. I've seen it as a tiny line at the soil line, but it's had that crust that I've been able to peel off. It can be really freaking sneaky. And so as climbers, I would encourage you to have the same practice. Sometimes consultants might be rushed for time, or we're talking to a client while we're looking at the tree. We might be distracted for some reason, but just get in the habit of walking around the base of the tree and looking for any number of things, but Kretzschmaria in particular. All right, so this book, I just kind of consider it to be the authority on everything. It's the most researched resource I have. And so a couple interesting things, I think we've covered most of this already, but yeah, so numerous zone lines, more than a lot of other fungal pathogens that produce zone lines. Commonly starts in wounds caused by mechanical damage. This is a refrain I hit with a lot of clients that are like, what can I do for my trees? It's like, don't mess them up, we think of healthcare from a human standpoint, like you go to a doctor and they do something to you to make you healthier. With trees, a lot of it is like avoid wounding the base. I had a lady who was super concerned about a massive, like 55-inch diameter willow oak in her driveway, and she had recently redone the driveway, and there were huge wounds all around the base of the tree because it hadn't been adequately protected when the company was installing the driveway. And it kind of sucked, but I said, you need to have this tree looked at like every year or every 2 years, the longest, because I didn't get too into the weeds with her, but each of those openings is now an opportunity for a spore from like weeping polypore or Kretzschmaria or some other decay organism to get it in and to start working its magic. So fire scars are another one. If any of you go hiking around Okanichi, there was a big fire there a couple of years ago, and a lot of those trees are now showing Kretzschmaria, like the chestnut oaks. It's pretty common in that area. So fire scars at the base, less of an issue in an urban environment, at least in North Carolina. So mechanical damage is really what is likely going to make a tree susceptible. It primarily spreads via airborne spores. There's some literature that indicates there is some overland spread, which means like via land, not over the land, but so through root grafts in particular. But very little research has been done to really confirm that or suggest how important of a spreading mechanism that is. And the reason why that's important is you'll have a lot of people that are asking about the susceptibility of nearby trees. And if you think about each patch of Kretzschmaria is likely producing millions, if not like billions of spores during each active season. Spores don't have a short shelf life. Like these things are in the environment. And so if there are other trees around a tree that has Kretzschmaria that have obvious basal wounds, then those may be trees that are worthwhile for them to have us come back, once every year or 2 years or just periodically to check on. But spreading via root grafting doesn't seem to be a really common mechanism. And then the last point that I found interesting from this book was that from the point of infection to the time a tree is fruiting, it's probably been a number of years. And just to reinforce that point, that if you see a small patch of Kretzschmaria on a tree, I don't think the literature supports the assumption that it's a new infection. Is just like really what I'm trying to drive home with that. And then we kind of covered my second point there. All right, so now for the rest of the slides, I'm just gonna show you a photo and I wanna hear whether you think it's Kretzschmaria or not. So we're gonna drill in recognizing this as a visual cue. So what do we think? We got some black around here, but the main reason why I use this photo is for these kind of like spots around the base of the tree. What do you think? Is it Kretzschmaria?
Yes.
No.
If you're saying no, why are you saying no?
It doesn't look quite like the first stage that you had, and it's also in small patches and not in one larger patch.
Yeah. So I haven't ever seen myself Kretzschmaria that looks like this, and to just like give up the game really quick. But I have seen photos of Kretzschmaria on European beach where it does kind of have this like one kind of blob and then a series of smaller blobs. But the main thing is this coloration in the interior, this kind of like pinkish purple is the good one. This is like giraffe spots, or is what it might be called, or there's another disease called silverleaf spots that it might be. But yeah, not Kretzschmaria. All right, what do we think? So of course, the white fruiting bodies, that is lumpy bracket. That's obviously not Kretzschmaria, but I'm talking about this like center portion. What do you think, Kretzschmaria? And I know it's tough. We're working off a flat image, but
Probably not.
and why do you say probably not?
Partly the location.
Mhm.
Partly I expect a lot of.
That's about 4 feet off the ground, by the way,
Okay. I mean, it could
or
be
chest height.
there, but it could also just be this other stuff that kind of oozes out of a sore and then
Yeah, because we're
kind of crusty stuff.
yeah we've got a section of included bark right there, right? Yeah, 2 stems with included bark. But yeah, you're right. So this is not Kretzschmaria. There are, if you were able to take a closer look, you'd see shoestrings, rhizomorphs associated with armillaria, and so there is some decay, and I think is like just like water's getting into that area and running out. We're seeing just like a general staining. But here, I was not able to pull off any crust. It was just bark that had been kind of like discolored. So that's what you weren't able to feel. But that's why I passed this around. It has a very particular, like hopefully you all kind of like pinched it. It's got a very particular kind of like old popcorny type of texture. So touch is a good way to verify. All right.
Hey Sam?
Yeah.
The other thing is, I've never met something else that crinkles like Rice Krispies when you put it up to your ear. So
Yeah.
the sound,
That's probably,
that's how I'll talk to clients, is I'll
Yeah.
sort of like play the fortune teller and be like, if you put this up to your ear, it will sound like Rice Krispie treats, and they do it, and they're like, oh, he's right, he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Like, it can be a useful tool when talking to clients.
I say old Cheetos. But
Or
that's
Cheetos,
old
yeah.
Cheetos, my surgery is an old popcorn.
okay. Yeah, so those are better comparisons. So Michael brought up that what he's communicated to people is that it has the texture of Rice Krispie treats. Yeah, that kind of crinkly. I like that. All right. So here we're looking at a maple, and it's blackened at the base. What do you think? So particularly, I'm looking at like this pocket in here between the roots. There are a couple of clues as to what this might be, kind of like up here. Are you able to see these like lines of horizontal rows? Does anyone, so Kretzschmaria, not Kretzschmaria? Does anyone want to give me a hypothesis for what this black stuff is and how it maybe came about? Sooty mold?
Maybe.
Yeah, you're right. It's sooty mold. And then what I was pointing out here, these horizontally aligned little holes, it's sap sucker damage. Sap has a small amount of sugar in it, and there is a fungus that colonizes that sugar. It doesn't damage the tree, it's purely aesthetic. Really, really common to see heavy blackened parts of southern sugar maple in particular. And I always really enjoy these property visits where people are concerned about their trees and to give them the news, because it's also kind of a fun story to talk about sapsuckers. So yeah, not Kretzschmaria. But
And to this point, sooty mold, I learned this year, sooty mold can take on a 3-dimensional aspect. If you've never seen that, don't get thrown off and think it's Kretzschmaria, because it will just bleed and bleed and bleed, and then the sooty mold will actually grow out from the tree. So it can take on sort of that 3-dimensional look to it that Kretzschmaria does have.
yeah, and we're actually gonna, so that's something that we're gonna cover in another slide. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so Michael was just saying some sooty molds will actually have body to them. It's not just like a discoloration. All right, so what do you think here? All this. Kretzschmaria, not Kretzschmaria? I'm seeing,
Glasses.
Could be.
I'll say yes.
No.
so Craig's saying no. Can you explain your,
I don't see I see it just flat.
yeah.
Looks like these fungal mats from hypoxylon on the upper parts.
So I had the benefit of seeing this tree in person. These is like a massive conglomeration of bleeding lesions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just really heavily widespread.
Yeah,
So something interesting might be going on here. And this was also like one of the big points I wanted to bring up. So it turns out that one of several issues that can produce bleeding lesions in a tree is actually Kretzschmaria. And this is coming from UMass Amherst, which is a research university up in New England. And then the Wikipedia page for Kretzschmaria, and the only reason I'm using the Wikipedia page is because I had this verified by the University of Amherst. But Kretzschmaria can produce bleeding lesions. So Phytophthora is something that's commonly associated with bleeding lesions, but armillaria can also produce bleeding lesions. Yeah, so bleeding cankers can also develop and may be confused with those caused by Phytophthora. So inconclusive, could be. We don't know. But I thought that was a really sort of interesting thing I learned digging into this. All right, so Michael gave up the game on this already a little bit. Oh no, it's great. I love that you anticipated that. So there is one species of sooty mold that at least that there might be more, but one in particular that occurs on beach. It's a close associate. It's actually an obligate associate of beach blight aphid. You know those wiggle butt white things that when you disturb them, they all kind of start raving. Yeah, so they produce a copious amount of honeydew, which is just unmetabolized sap that they excrete. And the buildup of, there's a specific species of sooty mold that will colonize their honeydew, and it's Scoria spongiosa, or like the honeydew eater, I think. And it will actually develop into balls that can be, I've seen it like softball size. Oftentimes you'll see it on branches. It starts off as kind of like a tan color, and then it goes black. And it's really, really soft. It's going to be spongy to the touch. So again, using your fingers to verify the Kretzschmaria identification is a really important part. All right, this is a sycamore. Kind of behind the botanical garden. What do you think?
Looks like someone threw an apple.
Yeah, I hadn't really ever thought of, or I've only been here a year and a half. In my time here, I've only rarely encountered Kretzschmaria on sycamores, but it does happen. All right. So I think this is, we're almost through these. So this is one more. So we kind of see this developing kind of like spot. We've got a canker here. What do you think? Yeah, so what about this is maybe tipping you off that it's not Kretzschmaria? Color.
A lot of things could be existing that's
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of the decay fungi that present themselves as, or their fruiting bodies as like hoof-shaped, they have these really kind of like indistinct globular phases that they might go through before their shape really begins to express itself. And so I believe that this is like some species of Phalaenus or Fomes, but it would still be something of concern, but it is not Kretzschmaria. Oh, we've got another one, okay. So this is a fair ways off the ground, you know, that, if I'm remembering correctly on that tree, that was above my head, at least the top part here. So,
Yes.
yeah, so yes from Craig, a few other yeses. Yeah, and so it is Kretzschmaria. And the main thing that I wanted to drive home with this is it in some cases, and it has been suggested that this is happening in really advanced stages, it will start to creep up the stem where it's no longer just at the base. I think, David, you've been in some trees where you've encountered it kind of at unusual heights. Do you want to say anything about that?
It's rare, but it's just all about paying attention. But now I'm thinking I might have misidentified it from this presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely the base of the tree, but it could be
Yeah. So this was a species of hickory, but yeah, a decent ways off the ground. A lot of tension, bringing it back. So final thought: don't trust the crust. So, anyways, any questions? I've pretty much said everything I know on the topic. So, yeah, Justin.
Sam, I imagine this is a pretty hard sell for the skeptical client who's really attached to their beautiful beech tree.
Yeah.
What would you say to?
There is a great article that I have attached to estimates a couple times, written by Purdue Landscaping. The head of that division, or someone who's at least really involved with Purdue, is also an arborist that you may have seen in like tree stuff materials, like Lindsay Purcell. He's got a well-written article that's more geared towards like homeowners talking about how concerning Kretzschmaria is. And I've only used this 1 or 2 times, but when I'm all in the back of my head, there's a running dialogue of how much do I think I sound like a salesman. And the more I'm trying to convince someone of something, the more that alarm goes off. And so that is something that I think a lot about when I'm with clients is how much does it sound like I'm just trying to sell a tree removal? Because they don't know that the fact, especially if they're a first-time client, that we consistently are in a role of telling people not to remove trees. So I have on rare occasions sent a fact sheet or told them about a fact sheet for them to look up. I do that a lot with EAB. I'll say, like, there's a lot of information about this. You don't need to trust me. Just Google EAB North Carolina, and you can do some of that research for yourself. So empowering them, giving them a place they might go to for more information. But yeah, Purdue has got a really good, succinct, non-fancy language write-up about brittle cinder fungus.
I just love to remind them that we make more money when we're pulling off the house.
That's great, yeah. I like that. I like that. Yeah.
It is something I like to tell folks, it is something that we can knowingly do that will knowingly lower risk, but at the same time, if we have a couple of high wind events per year or storms per year, we live in a place where other trees are also going to come down. So in those storms, but these are more likely to come down in those storms, especially if there's weighted or if there's, but also I think Sam's presentation of the unknowns is kind of nice.
So I've been watching this tree I noticed when I first moved here, and I've got the timer on my watch going to see how long it stays standing. So yeah, we can't tell someone that their tree is going to come down. The part of the track methodology is sort of picking a time frame and then telling them how likely within that time frame something is to happen. And I just don't really feel comfortable like with Kretzschmaria I don't have the anecdotal experience of like watching a tree for 10 years with it. All I know is what's been published, and what's been published isn't like super encouraging. And so from a production perspective, I think the takeaway is to really just avoid heavy rigging, guys. If it's a maple, consider secondary remote tie-in points, and then just be really cautious. Yeah, it's not worth it. So, any other questions?
So it's more or less, it can be safe to climb it. It's more like heavy rigging or like lateral forces on it that would.
Yeah, I would say
make it more
no
dangerous.
rigging.
Yeah.
Remote rigging.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, so Ben just said, yeah, don't rig. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam.
Huh?